So good afternoon, everybody. I hope you all had a fantastic conference. You're on the home straight now, the last afternoon. Still a very, very exciting session to come, so thank you for sticking with us. Today we're going to be hearing 4 presentations, not 5 as advertised. Unfortunately, we had one person dropping out. We're going to have 4 presentations on the important topic of clinical trials, recruitment and retention. My name is Sasha Bozeat. I serve as the Global Medical Lead at Roche, and it's my pleasure to be the moderator of this session today. As it's a hybrid session, I'd like to extend a warm welcome to those who are joining us online. So welcome. We're sorry you can't be with us in the room today. So we're going to have our 4 presentations. We'll have a little bit longer for each one as we have only 4 rather than 5. So plenty of time for questions. Do please ask questions, be bold, be brave, join in the discussion today. And you can keep those till the end of each presentation, and then we will come around with a microphone and you can have the opportunity to ask your question then. So without further ado, I will introduce our first speaker, who is Thais Lorenzo. Thais has already presented here this week, so is probably known to some of you. Thais is from the Barcelona Beta Research Center, Spain, and she will talk to us about enhancing participant adherence to multi-domain lifestyle intervention, a very hot topic. So Thais, please take the stage.
Thanks very much, and thank you for the opportunity to speak today. So this session is about a different kind of aspect of inclusivity and diversity to that's kind of featured a lot in this conference. And that is the idea that people who are perhaps not able to provide their own consent to take part in research are often excluded from research. And what I'm going to talk through is a program of work that we're doing, developing kind of interventions to support inclusion of this underserved group. And there's a link at the end where you can find and access all these resources. So just to set the scene a little bit, so in the UK, and of course this will be replicated in lots of other countries, over 500,000 people with more advanced dementia. And for some people that might affect their ability to make decisions, including the decision about whether to take part in research or not. And that's been highlighted as an issue because there are lots of ethical, legal and practical challenges that we need to think through when we think about including people in research that are perhaps less able to provide their own consent. And of course there are different legal frameworks that apply depending on the type of research, whether it's a medicinal trial or not, and the jurisdiction. So even in the UK we have 2 different jurisdictions, and that will be replicated across Europe and beyond. But what we do know is that people with cognitive disabilities are often excluded from research, regardless of the kind of population. So we see that in lots of different populations who might encounter these challenges. And Alzheimer Europe themselves have highlighted that people with more advanced dementia are frequently excluded from research. And inclusivity in research, as we've heard throughout the conference, is a really key priority area, both for research funders, but also at kind of policy level, regulatory kind of level, and it features in the clinical trial regulations, that idea that a trial must be designed to be inclusive of the population who would receive the intervention in practice. And of course, the reason we want to include representative groups are because otherwise the results from our trials, from our research, are not generalizable to the population who would receive the intervention in practice. And that might be that the effectiveness is different for those populations, or the benefit and risk profile is different. And obviously the theme of the conference is all about opportunities. But if we exclude groups from research, the opportunity to contribute to and also to benefit from research is not equitable for all in society. And that idea as well of people having a voice, having knowledge to contribute that we feel has value, that they have value, and that's the idea of epistemic injustice if we don't include those voices. And ultimately, exclusion from research leads to what I term evidence-biased care, where we have more evidence for some groups in society than others, and ultimately that can contribute to a widening of the health inequalities that many of these groups already experience. So the challenges, I did some work to kind of map what those are, but they're obviously very complex, but essentially they can be kind of grouped as systemic issues. So when we think about the complexity of the legal frameworks involved, of the ethical review process involved, so often these studies need to be reviewed by specific ethics research committees, and also that paternalistic protection where people caring for either a formal or informal role, people who may have difficulty providing their own consent, will often try to shelter them, that idea that these are vulnerable groups who should be excluded from research, protected from the potential harms of research. The structural issues involved, so when you think about the research infrastructure that's designed to support research, that's usually designed for populations able to provide their own consent. And often when we need to take more time to support people to provide consent or to look at alternative processes, that takes more resource, more time, more support. And then the methodological issues, so eligibility criteria, and you think how often you see must be able to provide even written informed consent, certainly informed consent. And then the ways that we design interventions and who we include in that process, so whether it's appropriate for people who may need additional support to engage. And outcome measures that often are designed, again, for populations able to complete them themselves. So the work I'm presenting today is a research program which uses a kind of systems-based approach to, first of all, identify and then try and address some of these challenges. It extends to public involvement, of course, so that's threaded throughout. And what I'm going to present today are 4 of the kind of key outputs of this work. And that's some work to identify those barriers and facilitators, to develop tools to help us design trials that are more inclusive of these populations, to think about how we can support families who are often involved in contributing to or making a decision on behalf of someone who lacks capacity about whether they're included in research. And then also thinking about that idea of how we can enable people to perhaps express their wishes, their preferences about research ahead of time. So I'm going to talk through those kind of 4 areas. So the barriers and facilitators was a qualitative study where I interviewed researchers, healthcare professionals who are involved in research or caring for people in lots of different kind of settings and populations who may encounter additional challenges around consent. This led to the identification of 3 themes that you can see kind of captured there. First of all, around the complexity of trials. And you can see the quote there on the side that very much captures that idea that actually for a researcher, considering including people who may have impaired capacity to consent is like this black box of horrendousness that they just shy away from, that they feel there's very little guidance. If they get it wrong, the ethics police will come for them. But also the importance of having access to more appropriate support and resources, and also the need for greater knowledge and how we can support researchers in the future. And I say that led to some key recommendations both for funders, for policymakers, and for researchers themselves. But what came out of this is that need for researchers to have a more kind of supported way of thinking about how they can design research to be more inclusive. And that led to the development of the Include Impaired Capacity to Consent framework. And this arose out of work that's been going on in the UK by the NHR, the National Institute for Health and Care Research. They had an Include initiative, which was looking at inclusion of underserved groups more broadly in research. And they developed a number of tools, including ethnicity framework that was designed to support researchers to design research that's more inclusive of people from ethnic minority backgrounds. So we used the same approach, but adapted it for this population. And this was a tool that we launched last autumn. We had developed it, again, in conjunction with a range of researchers and also public involvement contributors, and also developed an accompanying website of resources. And you can see we developed it over 5 stages. First of all, to kind of scope whether this was a tool that people thought would be useful to them, whether it was suitable for all populations who may encounter impaired capacity. And then we did some work to pilot the framework and then refine it, and then an implementation stage as well. And you can see at the bottom there the kind of different groups that we used to inform the different phases of work. So when we think about what's in the framework, what it kind of consists of, you can see it's using the kind of 4 key questions that you can see in the middle. And again, that's the same approach that the ethnicity framework has used. So it'll at least be consistent for researchers using this and other frameworks. And it encourages researchers to think about who the population they need to include are, who will receive the intervention in practice, to then think about the intervention they're developing and testing, whether there are differences in the way that some people might be able to engage in it, might respond to it, and then importantly to think about the design of their study. So the eligibility criteria, the consent process, data collection, how inclusive is that of different populations, and then also the analysis and dissemination stages as well. And it encourages researchers to then develop what kind of strategies, what kind of processes, what kind of resources they might need to put in place. And when that's used at the earlier stage, of course, they can incorporate that into a funding application. So the additional time, resources that might be needed can actually be kind of factored in. And of course, that might include having alternative forms of information, not just along a participant information sheet. And what we've also done then is to develop this implementation toolkit to go alongside it. That includes resources such as a library of completed frameworks, so people can kind of have a kind of reference to what other researchers have suggested. And because public involvement is a key part of this, we've also developed an easy read guide to using the framework so it can support public involvement throughout that kind of process. And then a whole website of resources, so examples of accessible information sheets, for example. We've made some recommendations for researchers when thinking about using this framework, that it's a collaborative process, it should be used from the outset and throughout. And of course, the title of this session is not just about recruitment, but retention. So when we think about people who may lose capacity during a study, if we don't plan for that eventuality at the outset, they might be excluded from continuing in the study. We also encourage researchers to have public involvement. That is inclusive in itself, and also to set aside the time to do this from the outset and to include that in the funding application. And then moving on to think about some of the other work. So some of the work I did a few years ago was to think about how families who are involved in making a decision, contributing to a decision on behalf of someone who's not able to provide their own consent. And I talked through actually how they had found that process and what they thought their kind of information and support needs might be. So this included families of people living with dementia and other conditions. And what this found is actually these kind of decisions can be quite challenging for people to make in practice. They felt very isolated, they felt very unsupported, they worried about making the decision and whether it was the right decision, and they called for more support for families making decisions in the future. So we developed a decision aid, a decision support tool, which again is a kind of structured way of helping people think through what's involved in the study, and whether they think the person that they represent would have wanted to take part in a study based on what they know about that person's kind of wishes and values. We're trialling this decision aid in what's termed a SWOT study, so we embed it in multiple different other studies and then explore whether actually it's helped family members make a more informed decision, more supported decision, and one that better reflects the person's values that they're representing. And that's ongoing at the moment. And then the last area of work is how actually we can think about this much earlier on than when we suddenly find ourselves with someone who lacks capacity to consent and are having to kind of put interventions in place then. And this uses very much the same kind of idea that we think about advanced care planning, about other forms of advanced statements, advanced wishes, where people who might anticipate losing capacity in the future find a kind of way of discussing, documenting, expressing their wishes about what they would wish to happen. And currently this often doesn't include research. You know, we think about care, treatment, financial matters, but actually some people might also wish to express what they would like in terms of research in the future. So this uses that same concept, if you like, and we've termed it advanced research planning. And in some countries, they already have a mechanism for people to do this when signing up to, for example, the equivalent of joint dementia research in Australia, Step Up for Dementia. So we've done some work in the UK to explore, first of all, is this something that might seem acceptable and feasible? We conducted a study which involved 277 people living with conditions, including dementia, and people caring for them, and just general members of the public too. And then also 50 researchers and healthcare professionals. And you can see there was really strong support for introducing advanced research planning in the UK. And the healthcare professionals and researchers thought it really important that people have the opportunity to do so as well. But of course, there's lots of kind of implementation issues that we need to think through. And I'm now exploring those in qualitative interviews. And again, it's a lot of kind of context coming out through those kind of interviews. And ultimately, the aim is to develop a kind of tool, a kind of advanced research planning intervention. So to kind of conclude, so research should include all populations who would receive the intervention in practice, that trials involving people that might have additional challenges around providing their own consent are currently excluded, and that leads to a lack of opportunities. And so we need to design research that's more inclusive, more responsive to people's communication and capacity needs. We've developed a whole range of methodological interventions that we hope will support inclusion in research. But further research is needed, particularly around that, thinking about how we can help people to plan ahead of time. And that's the website. You can find all the resources and papers that I've mentioned. And please do get in contact for any more details. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Victoria. A really fascinating presentation. I really love the practical recommendations that you've developed and the resources as well. Maybe I can sneak in with a question first of all on that, because I'd like to know, how broadly are these being utilised, and what could we maybe do to support them going even further?
Yeah, thank you. That's a really good question. So the first stage has been to kind of get them embedded into funders' guidance, and in the UK we have the Health Research Authority, so that kind of regulator of research. So they're all now signposting to these resources for researchers who are designing research, conducting research. So it's sort of getting it in at that kind of early stage is really key. The website itself, we can see that has a lot of activity, so a lot of people are accessing and downloading these tools. And then we also get that kind of contextual factor as well. So different populations, people living with dementia, but people living with other conditions. There are also kind of things that we need to think about more specific to those populations. So we work very closely with researchers working with those different populations as well to develop them and help them use them, kind of implement them in their kind of work as well.
Excellent, thank you. I think this is really critical work, and I'm sure there's going to be a lot of interest. Before we just check the room, I would just like to remind people watching us online that they can ask questions via some sort of chat facility, I'm imagining. I've got an iPad here. Questions will come through to me, so please do ask questions if you're sitting at home watching us online as well. Anybody in the room would have a question for Victoria? Yes. Lady over there in the lovely orange dress.
Oh, thank you. I love your suit too, but I think I told you that already.
We need to stand together, the two of us.
Hi, Dr. Shepherd. My name is Sophie Lou Axelson. I'm from Sweden in the Queen Sylvia Nursing Award. We have a heavy emphasis on nurse talent and nurse leadership, especially in the sphere of geriatric and dementia care. We also have a challenge in that nurses are playing an exceedingly important role in a lot of trials or a lot of initiatives in Sweden. And while they are extremely skilled, they're not always in the capacity to retain the people who have made it through multiple rounds of getting to a trial or an initiative. We're even finding that they're dropping out. Patients that have MCI, I know of one trial, one group that they're supporting very, very early MCI. It's taken a long time for this group to get funding, get together. The person who is holding on to it is losing them because these are people who want to engage on Instagram, Facebook, Snapchat, and this nurse doesn't want to do that. So I was wondering, on the flip side, is there anything that healthcare professionals can do to retain also in their day-to-day interactions, or their interactions? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That's really interesting. And I think we would recognise a lot of those challenges ourselves. I guess one of the points is that the framework can encourage people to think ahead of time about strategies they might wish to put in place. So we might often encourage people to sign up with a study partner who can then support involvement in the research. We also do a lot of embedding studies within existing trials where we can explore different strategies that might help support inclusion and retention in a trial as well. And often those are led by, for example, the nurses supporting the study as well. So that kind of brings that opportunity to develop their own research skills that they're more invested and interested in kind of pursuing, as well as then actually learning from a research that goes on that we can then use for future trials as well. So yeah, a couple of different things, but I would certainly recognise those challenges.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Any other questions for Victoria? Yes, lady at the back there. We've got a microphone making its way to you now. Thanks for your patience.
Thank you so much, Vicky. Just mine is more practical questions. So if you want to work with, for example, care home residents with advanced dementia, and they need to get to know you, but often I'm faced with challenge of like getting through the gatekeepers. So like managers, maybe matrons who might be caring enough, but might not necessarily be believing in research, or are they people, it's kind of meaningful for these residents to take part in research. And could you share bits of like kind of practical hints and tips? How do you talk to clinicians who might be not seeing the really importance of these people taking part in research? What do you do?
Yeah, again, another great question, and you're right. And we know, I also have a portfolio of care home research, so we know that somewhere around 70% of people living in a care home might not be able to provide their own consent. And when I mentioned about that kind of paternalistic approach, that's often that kind of gatekeeping aspect, that concern that actually people are too frail, not well enough to take part in research, and that leads to that kind of lack of evidence base. So we would normally encourage those kind of early conversations. Often care homes are concerned about the kind of ethical issues that I've mentioned, so we often provide a summary to care homes around how that links to the Mental Capacity Act, for example. But it is about building relationships, and both with care homes and through care home networks as well, where people can sign up to take part in research like Enrich we have in the UK. But it is really about kind of building confidence, building relationships and maintaining those as well. That's often very hard between individual trials. But yeah, really, really important questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we're going to have to move along now. Another round of applause, please, for Victoria. Fantastic presentation. So we stay in the UK now. We stay with the theme of inclusion. We've got Sarah Griffiths, who's a senior research fellow from UCL, and she's going to talk to us about inclusion of people living with dementia in research and findings from the PriDem feasibility study. Thank you, Sarah.
Hi everyone, just adjust the mic, vertically challenged. So this talk is about including people with dementia in research, and really echoes some of the themes that Vicky has mentioned, but applied to a specific study, the PriDem feasibility study. The overall PriDem program is a primary care-led program. It's about developing and testing a primary care-led intervention to improve post-diagnostic care and support for people with dementia. And it's a collaboration between Newcastle University and University College London. So as Vicky has already talked about, people with dementia are underrepresented in research that actually investigates their care and support needs. And those people that do tend to be included are those in the early stages of dementia, or those who have carers who can support their inclusion. So, as Vicky said, this leaves a significant gap in the evidence base, and there's a real need for studies to both report on representation and to develop new strategies to support inclusion and retention in studies. So in the early stages of the PriDem program, an evidence-based primary care-led approach to post-diagnostic dementia care was developed, And the intervention comprised a clinical dementia lead supporting general practice staff to deliver 3 intervention strands: building knowledge and confidence in the workforce, developing care systems, and delivering tailored and holistic care and support. And researchers worked really closely with a dedicated group of people with dementia, carers, health and social care professionals throughout the whole process to both help shape the research methods and the intervention. And this group was called the PriDem Dementia Care Community. So we ran a 15-month mixed methods feasibility study to both test the intervention and our methods for supporting the inclusion of people with dementia. We wanted to test the inclusivity of our recruitment approach, and we also wanted to measure recruitment and retention rates, and importantly, to assess how acceptable the study procedures were for people living with dementia. So a 12-month intervention was developed to 7 general practices in the southeast and northeast of England. We aimed to include people who are community dwelling with a diagnosis of dementia, who either had capacity to consent to participate or a suitable consultee. And where appropriate and wanted, a carer participated alongside as well. We took a proactive, staged and ethical approach to recruitment with several opportunities to opt in and out, whilst we were trying to also avoid unwelcome pursuit of people. And we used a mix of letters and phone calls to sort of mitigate for people who might have difficulties with written communication. So an initial mail out was sent out with accessible written study information and also opportunities to request a video or audio version. And then up to 3 phone calls were made to follow up people that we hadn't been able to reach or who hadn't contacted us at each stage. And we made these phone calls at on different days and different times. And to do that, we worked together with the dementia care community to develop flexible scripts for researchers for these phone calls to make sure that they were acceptable to people with dementia and carers. And then researchers would inform GPs of any potential participants who we hadn't been able to contact at any of these stages, so that the GP could check for unmet need in the first instance, and then only where appropriate, alert people to the PriDem study. So in the study, people with dementia completed health-related quality of life outcome measures at baseline 4 months and 9 months, and carers also completed questionnaires and proxy measures alongside. And in order to investigate the acceptability of our various study measures, we completed qualitative interviews as part of our process evaluation. Okay, so in terms of recruitment, what was the outcomes? We recruited 60 people with dementia and 51 carers. Our original recruitment targets were based on the aim to include up to 20 GP practices. And so as we only involved 7 general practices, we feel like we did quite well with recruitment. And although this is a feasibility study and it's quite a small sample overall, it's still important to look at the inclusion of underrepresented groups within the sample of people with dementia to inform future studies. So 44.8% of people recruited did so via consultee, which demonstrates potential to involve people with more advanced dementia. 25.9% of people were living alone. 15.5% of people participated without a carer. In terms of ethnicity, 10.4% of people with dementia and 22.4% of carers were from a non-white ethnic background, and 17.3% of people with dementia were living in areas of socioeconomic disadvantage. So what were the reasons for people opting out at that sort of phone call stage or mail out stage? So besides physical ill health, which was the most common reason, the next 3 common reasons were the strain that carers are already under. In one carer's words, we're too busy doing all the dementia care. The person with dementia gets anxious talking with new people, and the person with dementia doesn't want to talk about dementia. And that could be for a variety of reasons, including not really accepting the diagnosis. We for people that did participate in the study, carers often told us early on which terms people preferred, and that was really individualized. So for instance, one participant was okay with cognitive impairment, but not so much with dementia. So as researchers, we just got to learn from the beginning how to speak to people, and through that sort of retain their confidence and trust. So in terms of withdrawals, throughout the study, 14 people with dementia withdrew from the study, and you can see the reasons listed here. A lot of them are very common reasons for withdrawing from studies, especially with a particular age group. The person that was upset with their GP surgery really explained to us that they felt they hadn't had any care and support at all from their GP post-diagnosis, that this hadn't changed since being in the study, and they didn't feel it was likely to change. And this understandable cynicism was echoed by some of the people we spoke to on the phone who opted out at that recruitment stage. So, back to our learning now from this study. What have we learned about recruiting people with dementia? We've learned that in a future study we need more strategies to support carers to take part, including things like making sure there's adequate funding for replacement care. We've learned that we probably need to work harder on the accessibility of our study information resources by working more with people with lived experience of dementia to make sure that we really sort of hit on those anxieties that people with dementia might have and make sure they have all the information and reassurance that they need. And one thing that researchers found really challenging was explaining to potential participants an intervention that is essentially a service level intervention. So there was no like immediate concrete offering to participants, and we weren't really sure whether and when the work with GP practices was going to trickle down to them. At this stage, it was really unclear. So that really links in with the cynicism that I've already mentioned. And what we need to do is really work hard to develop some strategies to overcome that cynicism and encourage people to take part whilst, living with these uncertainties about what the research is going to show. And we don't have the answers to that at the moment, so if anyone's got any ideas, we'd be really grateful. And then what did we learn about conducting outcome measures? So we did develop a hybrid approach to our contacts with people with dementia, but most people preferred in-person contact with researchers in their own home because they felt that brought much needed company and conversation, especially post-COVID, and they really enjoyed the visits from researchers. Also, despite the fact that we'd piloted doing the outcome measures with the dementia care community, this led to an underestimation of the time it would take us. So our visits were usually sort of up to 2 hours, sometimes more than that, because often people want to talk around the outcome measures. They want to offer us cake and cups of tea after we've finished everything, so we stay and chat with them, which was lovely. And 10 of the carers completed some of their questionnaires online. We had that as an option, and they chose to do that after meeting with a researcher in person, and they found that an acceptable option. All of us as a research team, we were all really alert to signs of fatigue and distress because we were spending quite a long time with people, and researchers on the whole handled that really sensitively, flexibly, compassionately. As one carer says, I could imagine some researchers might hold themselves outside it. I can't get involved. But actually, it's such a sad and difficult thing. So if somebody doesn't say to you, it is tough, or, oh yes, I can see that's tricky, whatever it might be, I do find that helpful, just that acknowledgement. And then also, because this was a feasibility study, we were trying out several different outcome measures to see which were most acceptable. And now we have a better idea of what was more acceptable to both researchers and participants. And in a future study, we just more or less decided we would probably drop the DEN call because that was the one that was least acceptable for a variety of reasons. Okay. Ooh. Okay, so and finally, we found that just some really simple strategies that we employed to support retention, but also make taking part a positive experience, were much more powerful than even we anticipated. So, for example, we developed some written cue cards to support people to respond to some of the questionnaire items. And this was used with people with dementia and carers, so not singling any group out for special support. But it helped everyone with recall, keeping on track. Participants were able to respond privately just by pointing if their relative was kind of in earshot and they didn't want to know what the response was. And it also saved our voices as researchers, so it was a real kind of win-win situation for that simple strategy. We would usually phone ahead before we went to visit people to remind people of the planned visit and to just check it was still convenient, and that was really appreciated by participants. And then finally, we tried to make sure that the same researcher visited the same person with dementia and their family on each follow-up. And it was hard to achieve that because we had a change of staff in the different sites. But we managed it in some cases, and I think overall researchers did develop really good relationships with the participants. So, some final thoughts. So a future larger implementation study is warranted. We did quite well with the recruitment. But for a future study, we'd really consider ways to enhance inclusion and retention even further, develop new strategies based on our learning. We would say that funding should not really underestimate the time and researcher capacity needed to support inclusion and retention. This is intensive and skilled work from researchers, and participants really need time and support to engage and build trusting relationships with researchers, and that's what we need to improve inclusion and retention. Thank you very much to our PriDem Dementia Care community, the wider team, Robin, Rachel and Zena, who were instrumental, and of course our funders, the Alzheimer Society. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Fantastic presentation, really great initiative. Any questions for Sarah? I would have a question while people are thinking about it. And that's, did you see any influence? You showed some demographics there of the group. Did you see any influence of demographic? I'm thinking, you know, gender, age, any of these things that are influencing the sort of propensity to participate?
Well, we were talking about that earlier, and I think in terms of gender, it was probably like fairly typical of a lot of studies. So we had slightly more men than women with dementia, but it was like 57% men. And then with carers, we had a lot more women than men, so it was like 75% women for carers, but I think that's reflected across a lot of different studies.
Yeah.
So in terms of age, I think the mean age of people with dementia was sort of 80, 81. Mm-hmm. The mean age of carers was like 65, which kind of, you know, there's a big range within that, but it reflects the fact that we did have carers that were sons and daughters as well as spouses.
Yes,
yeah.
People with busy lives, and I'm sure these are factors you've got to take into account when you're kind of considering these sort of projects. Any questions from the audience? Oh, yes. Lady here.
Thank you for your wonderful presentation. I don't know, I have a small question. I don't know if you can relate, but as a researcher, I find that sometimes people with dementia, or even just also caregivers, sometimes forget that we are researchers and they start treating us as clinical staff or doctors. They even say, "Doctor, can you help me?" Or they ask about other treatment or clinical assessments. And because I want to build a good relationship with my participants, I often forget that they confuse us with other clinical staff. I don't know, is there any way how to still keep that boundary and avoid just wanting to always help them, but still have to remember that I'm just a researcher?
Yeah, that's such a brilliant question, and one that we've talked about a lot in our team and with other researchers and other studies. It is really hard because you want to build up a good relationship, and I think you just have to kind of find the balance between, you're a researcher, so you're not there to give the answers, but you're still really interested in the participants as people, and you want to empathize and sort of build that strong relationship. I think it's quite hard as well when you have a clinical background, because I am a speech and language therapist, but in this role, I'm a dementia researcher. And so when you give a bit of yourself in the relationship, sometimes your clinical background comes out, and then it's very difficult to go back to anything like boundaried. But you have to sort of, I think you just have to kind of find your way with that. One thing that we found really helpful is that we developed a list of local resources, support groups, where to go to for different things. One of our team produced a really comprehensive resource list that we would give to people. And we found that quite helpful, that we had something to give. Yeah.
Excellent question, thank you. Any last final questions? We're running out of time, so we probably should move on, but thank you very much, Sarah, great. So we move to our last speaker already. We're switching gears a little bit here now. We're switching gears in terms of topic and also geographical location. We're going to hear from Ana Perez, who is a neuropsychologist, a PhD fellow from the Department of Neurology, Oslo University Hospital, and she's going to talk to us about classifications of MCI and its potential selection bias in an AI-based modelling. Thank you, Anna. Over to you.